This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
Changing it up this week, we go to Australia and talk to Lushington D. Brady about the voice, net zero, and the cost of living crisis in Australia. Lushington D. Brady describes himself as a punk rock philosopher, liberalist contrarian, a grumpy old bastard, and a freelance writer. Lushington's also written a book, essentially an anthology of his writing at the BFD. It's called Shouting Across the Ditch, and I've got Lushington D. Brady with me now from Tasmania. Welcome.
Welcome, g'day, and hello to New Zealand. How are you all?
Well, I thought we'd have an Australian perspective on life and politics for the political tragics, just so that we can add a bit more depth so we don't delve into just New Zealand-only politics. So let's just have a discussion, Lushington, about, well, let's start off with the thing that everybody's talking about with Australia, this so-called voice referendum. What is it?
Yes.
How did it come about? And what the hell has John Farnham got to do with anything?
Poor old John. I'm not a big fan, but poor bugger's going through a lot of troubles with illness at the moment, so I do wish him the best. So the voice, it's essentially the same agenda in New Zealand as you have with Hapua Three Waters. It's a co-governance thing, just by another name. How it came about, it's like a big difference between Australia and New Zealand is that Australia never had a treaty like Waitangi.
Yeah.
With one possible exception, and essentially because it was impossible. I mean, the Maori in New Zealand were organised enough that Hobson could get together the major chiefs and sign an agreement. In Australia, they were you essentially dealing with 150 major language groups alone, and each of those would be divided up into, sort of loose sort of tribes, and the basic organising unit was a band, mostly of an extended family, could be a couple of dozen or maybe 100 or so at most. I think Jeffrey Blaney put it in perspective, said the average pre-contact Aboriginal Australian would maybe meet 1,000 different people in their lifetime. So signing a treaty with of any meaningful thing with that was just impossible. John Batman did try when he set up his village on the shores of Port Phillip Bay, but that treaty was never recognised by colonial authorities because he was essentially a privateer. And it's probably very unlikely that the Aboriginal men who signed it had any idea what they were doing, what Batman was doing anyway. They probably just thought, hey, this guy's giving us a bunch of gifts, and all we have to do is make a mark on a piece of paper. Cool. Yeah. So, there was never a treaty. So, and that became an issue in the sort of 60s and 70s with the rise of the Aboriginal rights movement. And eventually we got to the point where by 2015, I think it was, the government, that was when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, convened what they called a Makarata, which was basically I'm trying to get my facts straight here. Anyway, it was a consultative group, and they came up with what was called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, as always, they're the left are very good at using emotive language, and it sounds really a nice cuddly thing. It's straight from the heart, but it was actually a very radical document, so much so that Turnbull and the Attorney General at the time, George Brandis, just said there is no way this would ever get past the Australian people. It's too radical. So it went into abeyance. Then I think 2019, Scott Morrison and his government were preparing legislation for an Aboriginal voice to Parliament. And the idea is a special consultative body to speak straight to Parliament on Aboriginal issues. Morrison went to an election before that legislation was finalised or tabled, and it was never spoken of during the election. Albanese never said a word about it, but the very day after the election, when the results were finalised, he announced a referendum, and this time it wasn't going to be legislated; it was going to be in the Constitution, and they've stuck to that since that it has to be in the Constitution.
It sounds almost like an argument from the castle, isn't it? It's the Constitution. It's
the vibe.
It's the vibe of the thing.
Very much so, and that's been the issue all along. Like, it took nearly a year before they even announced what the question would be.
What is the question, Lushington? Just for our listeners here in New Zealand.
I'd have to look that up. Essentially, its preamble is that to recognise if it's Indigenous Australians or First Nations, I think is the fashionable term these days, where that's come from. Yeah, it's basically just been imported from America. And
so the proposed question is to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration?
Yes, that's essentially it.
But what defines what the voice is?
Oh, well, that's been the issue all along. Essentially, Albanese has just said, we'll figure that out once we've passed the referendum. Leave it to Parliament.
That's a real slippery slope, isn't it? I mean, really.
Yeah. And nobody is really, even the people proposing it are contradicting each other. Linda Burney, the Indigenous Affairs Minister, said, for instance, it won't be able to say anything about changing the date of Australia Day. Whereas Thomas Mayo, who is the chair of the S23 campaign, straight up said that would be one of the first things we'd look at. The other question has been, would it be what they call justiciable, which means if the government, because that's another thing, what happens if the voice recommends something to the government and the government says no? If it's justiciable, it means that the voice can then take the government presumably to the High Court and have it ruled on there, where some of them are saying, well, no. Well, I think Robert, one of the sort of legal people behind it, basically said, on most matters, it won't be justiciable. I mean, most matters isn't. Yeah. So they're having an each way bet all the way. But even if it isn't, I mean, what is going to be the comeback for a government that tells a constitutionally enshrined body no?
Well, I mean, you mentioned about all the different peoples, nations, languages, etc.
Yeah.
How is someone going to be appointed or chosen to be part of the voice?
Again, that hasn't been finalised. The campaigners point to the Langton-Culmer report, which was the one actually drawn up for the Morrison government. And that is essentially that, it'll go to local bodies, they'll elect somebody. But still, like, how many people will be on it, how they will be chosen, etc., isn't finalised at the moment. There's no draft legislation in place. The Culmer-Langton report is just that, a report. I don't think it even has the status of a white paper.
So the Australian public are being asked to vote on a proposal that is pretty much an open door with no defined goals, ideals, or even numbers of people who are supposed to represent this voice. Do you agree with the voice, and we'll sort it all out later?
Yeah, and they've been very tricky with the referendum question in tying it to the idea of recognition as well. That's another issue entirely. Should the Constitution specifically recognise Aboriginal Australians? People point to say the Canadian Constitution, the Finnish Constitution, which do recognise their Indigenous peoples, but no campaigners say in response to that, well, the Constitution refers to the Australian people of every state and territory, and surely that includes Aboriginal Australians. Are they Australian or not?
Mm.
And that is probably, certainly for me, the single issue against the voice is it's a racially exclusive clause in the Constitution. Yeah, I thought we were supposed to get rid of that in 1967, where the Section 5118, I think what's called the race powers, specifically excluded Aboriginal people. In 1967, the reference to Aboriginal people was struck out, so it's now just the people of any race. Personally, I think the race powers section should be gone entirely. There should be no reference to race at all in the Constitution. And so it is essentially an apartheid bill. Yeah, people say, oh, but apartheid was just South Africa and discriminating against black people. Well, technically, yes, but that's like saying, well, democracy only applies to landowning males in Athens. Yeah, that's what it was originally, but it's become a blanket term, and essentially apartheid is any exclusive privilege or granted by law to any racial group, and that's exactly what the voice is. And that's like the astonishing lie of the Yes campaign is they say it's not about race. How is it not? I mean, how are Aboriginal Australians not a race as much as, say, Irish, Greek, Italian Australians, British Australians?
Well, it's interesting because from a Kiwi perspective, we're looking at this debate in Australia and saying to Australians, don't go here. You are heading down the same path that New Zealand has headed down, and particularly in the last 6 years, and with our government in New Zealand introducing race-based policies, medical apartheid, all sorts of various different ways to separate elements of society, and race being one of those. We've even had this government split the health system in two, into a Maori health system and then everyone else. And it's even come down to, and at Auckland Hospital, for example, if you're a Maori, you can pay $3 for all-day car parking, but if you're anybody else, you pay the going rate on the parking buildings near the hospital.
Mm. Yeah, that's a very dark path, and okay, at least some of the people behind it, no doubt, are doing so with the best of intentions, and I know I can see that. But they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I mean, no one would deny that Aboriginal Australians are disadvantaged, but is this the route we want to take to fix it?
Yeah, it's a lot of this, I guess, stems from the declaration by the British government in 1788 that Australia, or in particular at that time, New South Wales, being the colony, was terra nullius. There was no people there.
I am not entirely sure if that's correct. There was a doctrine of terra nullius gradually adopted, but I don't know that it was ever official, like Britain's official view. Certainly, if you look at Captain Phillips drafting orders when he was setting up the colony in 1788,
yeah,
he was ordered to conciliate the affections of the native peoples, and to ensure that no injury was done to them. And to his credit, Philip tried. He was, for instance, he published they put up basically posters around the Sydney area showing visually like an Aboriginal man attacking a British man getting hanged, a British man attacking an Aboriginal man being hanged. They were trying to at least establish that, their law applied equally to everyone. But you had two such disparate cultures, as Geoffrey Blaney has said, one which had just invented the steam engine, the other which didn't have the means to boil water, which is not a slur, it's just a simple observation. So you're probably the most widely disparate cultures on earth. And there had to be conflict, and it was unfortunate. But there are a lot of myths around it. Like there was another one that does the rounds on social media quite often, which is that prior to 1967, Aborigines were counted under the Flora and Fauna Act. That's a complete fabrication. It's just not true.
Yeah.
The other one is that 1967 granted Aborigine citizenship. Again, not true. They already were citizens. They didn't have full rights. Basically, what 1967 was about was striking out the exclusion of Aborigines from the race powers, which basically says the Commonwealth shall make orders for the good blah 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 of any race, and originally said except the Aborigines, and so that was struck out.
Yeah.
So it still does mean that the government can pass racial laws, which I think is very wrong. The other thing that 1967 did was to basically say that to drop the clause that excluded Aborigines from the census, from the national census, which was a holdover from colonialism, because at Federation, when they were trying to get the 7 different colonies all to agree, the eastern states, who had fairly small Aboriginal populations, said, well, how do we know that South Australia and Western Australia aren't going to use their Aborigines as pawns, basically, to override the other states? And so, that was why they were excluded from the census. Again, that was remedied in 1967.
Yeah.
So, to my mind, the Voice is basically reversing the gains of 1967. In 67, we took racial exclusion out. In 23, they're wanting to put it back.
Which is exactly what's happening in New Zealand too. I don't think in a positive way it's contributing to New Zealand. You're seeing a division in society based on race. And, we all protested that when South Africa was doing that. And for some reason, it seems to be okay to be heading New Zealand and now Australia down the path of racial division and then on all of the polarization that comes along with that at the same time. But,
yes.
But it's not going too well for the yes people, though, is it? I saw a poll the other day that showed that they're now well in the minority now, and the anti-voice vote is growing, whereas the yes vote is shrinking.
Yes, and that's it. The yes vote peaked around the time the referendum was announced, and since then it's been constantly going downhill. And I mean, initially, as you would probably expect, older voters and men were more opposed. More conservative states like Tasmania, Queensland were also more opposed. But that has steadily reversed, because the thing to understand about Australian elections is it's not a simple national majority. Referendums.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how it works in New Zealand. In Britain, say, with Brexit, it was a national majority. Whoever got past the post, the referendum was passed.
Yeah.
In Australia, the founding fathers were pretty clever, I thought, in making constitutional change very difficult. So you have to get not just a national majority, but a majority in each of a majority of states. So Australia has 7 states. At least 4 of them must have a majority in each state for the referendum to pass.
So it's 50% plus 1 in all of the 7 states.
Yep.
And 50% plus 1 overall
across the country.
Well. Yeah.
Yeah. So
it makes it almost impossible to change the Constitution in that manner then. So Albanese's, gone all in on this. Is a negative result going to affect his standing, in a similar way to John Key, who pushed to change the New Zealand flag and was utterly convinced that he could convince most New Zealanders that his way was the best way, and then lost the referendum and kind of at the same time lost his will to carry on being Prime Minister?
Yes, and as David Cameron did with Brexit as well. I mean, technically it shouldn't affect the government, but practically, especially when a Prime Minister so nails his colours to that mast, it has to be, a blow. Because as I said, Albanese announced the referendum out of nowhere the very day after the election. He's declared that it's the number one priority of his first term in government. Note the hubris there, first term, not only term. And that also, I think, has been a big factor in the growing no vote. Australia, we've got a cost of living crisis, we've got a housing crisis, we've got an energy crisis, and the government's number one priority is a race-based referendum.
I guess you could cynically say that Albanese is getting this out of the way in the first year of his government, because you have 4-year terms.
Yeah.
If he gets it out of the way, the no vote wins. He then essentially has 2.5 years to make everybody forget about it.
I think that's quite probable, and also, I think he wanted his big moment. John Howard had the Port Arthur gun law reform moment. Kevin Rudd had the national apology. So I think, a lot of it was just Albanese wants to, have a big feel-good issue that he can nail to his resume.
What is it with these, small in stature politicians wanting to have these big things to put their name to?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's not something that couldn't have been done by normal parliamentary process, by legislation. That's what Scott Morrison was preparing to do. Of course, the Yes campaign's answer to that, well, if it's legislated, it can always be repealed. And it's like, well, yes.
That's the general
if it's
idea.
Legislated, if it's legislated, it turns out to be a dog, the next government can get rid of it. And surely they should, and some of the analogies they use are ludicrous. Like they say, oh, well, no one complains about big business or anyone else having access to Parliament. It's like, but they're not in the Constitution. And by that measure, don't Aboriginal Australians have a voice already? They can lobby their local member. They've got representative bodies.
They can stand for Parliament.
Yeah, and a great many do, and are very successful. In fact, proportional to population, Aboriginal Australians are slightly overrepresented in Parliament. And look, good on the people who run and stand and get elected.
I mean, I guess the real question is how is having the voice, for want of a better term, going to improve the lot of all Australians, particularly with those crises that you mentioned. The cost of living crisis would be similar in Australia as to what we're experiencing here, with higher fuel prices and food prices and all of that. Let's just get off the voice for now. I think we've kind of covered that to death. Let's talk about the cost of living crisis in Australia and what the politicians are saying and what they're doing about it.
Well, I mean, it feels pretty bad here. Presumably, it's not as bad as New Zealand, given the scale of trans-Tasman migration at the moment. But it is biting. Just today, Coles data was leaked from Coles, who are basically your equivalent of Countdown, the big supermarket chain.
Yeah.
Although I think Countdown are actually owned by Woolworths, but we have a duopoly in Australia rather than a monopoly.
Well, they've just announced they're going to rename all the Countdowns in New Zealand Woolworths. So we've got a duopoly here, and I imagine it's a duopoly in Australia as well.
Yes, and so their sales data was leaked, and it's showing that Australians are cutting back heavily on, I guess, what you could call non-essential essentials. We're not talking about cutting back on buying avocados or pate or anything. People are cutting back on things like hand wash, sponges, kitchen cleaners, that sort of thing, which I guess are not technically essentials, but they are essentials. And sales in those have plummeted in the last 12 months and even in the last month. So it's quite obvious that people are having to cut back heavily, especially a lot of people who may have bought a house, say, in the last 5 years, and are seeing we've had we've basically had straight interest rate rises ever since Albanese was elected. They're just going to be changing the RBA governor now, so that may change if it's a particularly political appointment. But mortgages are going up, and unfortunately, unlike the 80s where mortgage interest rates went up to like 15%, the sheer cost of buying a house now means that a 1% shift in mortgage rates can make or break people.
Is the government in Australia, blaming external inflation on inflation causing all these things? They do that in New Zealand. They say, it's the war in Ukraine's causing inflation in New Zealand. But we've just seen some statistics released today saying that international tradables are only contributing 22% of the inflation in New Zealand, and non-tradables, i.e. domestic inflation, is 78%. Is it the same for Australia? And are people seeing through the politicians laying the blame at externalities for actually their frivolous and wasteful spending that's fueling the inflation?
Yeah, well, I couldn't quote the numbers like that, but I shouldn't imagine it would be any different. The only way that, say, the war in Ukraine could affect Australia is in, say, the cost of gas, because, suddenly, as Donald Trump warned them and was laughed at for, Europe was heavily dependent on gas from Russia. That's now being cut off, and they're up the creek. So Australia is exporting a lot of gas because exporters can make a ton more, by selling it overseas than they can locally.
Yeah.
And so, but it's more, people are really seeing through, especially things like the energy prices. I mean, Albanese promised, I think, some 90-odd times during the election campaign that they would lower household electricity bills by about $275 a year. Instead, they're going up about $500, depending which state you're in. And that was where, they're firmly committed to net zero. And again, Net Zero Australia, the government's body they set up to oversee it, released a new report. And it's just diabolical, like how they can put out a report like that and still say this is good policy, I do not know. For instance, it's just showing yet again that modelling is rubbish. because when Albanese said about lowering prices, the electricity prices, said, and I know we're going to do it because we've done the modelling. And now the modelling has
Danger
just been,
Will Robinson.
Yeah, it's just been completely busted. And for instance, to go to even have a chance of going to renewables totally, we have to rebuild the entire grid, because grids as they are designed to run on constant, reliable feed, from a coal or gas or whatever station.
Nuclear.
Yeah. And so renewables are very intermittent, so the whole grid has to be rebuilt. And the thing is, they're committed by 2060, so they've got 40 years to rebuild an entire grid. And that doesn't count then. And they initially estimated that at costing only 78 billion, I think it was, or around 80 billion. Their new report now says 1.5 trillion. That's an
estimated cost,
and that's just for the transmission lines
on the first, to rebuild the network.
No, that's just to rebuild the network, to build the generation and everything else. We're looking at $7 to $9 trillion in 40 years. I mean, our annual GDP is 1.5 trillion. As we've got a post coming up in the BFD today, right? It would essentially mean we would have to add the equivalent of the cost of health and welfare, which are our two biggest budgetary costs. We would have to add that again every year for the next 40 years. It's equivalent to what we spent in World War One on defence.
Wow. I mean, our politicians in New Zealand don't yet use words that start with T. They use words that start with B, but the sums involved. I mean, I was talking to a electrical engineer the other day, and he was telling me about this push for electric cars in New Zealand is going to hit a roadblock. And I said, well, what sort of roadblock? And he said, well, in every suburb in most streets, there's a big green, electricity transformer in there. And he said, yeah. I said, yeah. He says, well, they'll all overheat at about 6:30 each night when someone comes home with their electric car and starts plugging it in. There's more and more of them being plugged in. That's going to require a massive drain on electricity, which is fed through that transformer, which isn't designed to do that and have that load. And so you're going to start seeing brownouts when you hit about 15 to 20% of the vehicles on the road are electric.
Yeah.
And we've got the same problem here, where our electricity reticulators and the electricity sector is talking about investing in renewables, but what they're not talking about is upgrading the grid. And we're even more exposed because we've got a cable between the North Island and the South Island. And most of the power that's generated in New Zealand is generated in the South Island, and it's exported to the North Island. But that cable is at capacity. So if we want to create more generating resources and more supply, you have to build it in the North Island, not the South Island. And the North Island's not conducive to it. So we've got this massive infrastructure. And then I'm told that the cost of putting a second cable across Cook Strait is in the billions. And no one's talking about that. But it sounds like Australia's got the same problem, that you just have the infrastructure to support these wet dreams of these politicians.
They just assume that it will happen. Pardon me. Yeah. So, like they talk, for instance, the report itself acknowledges that it will have to cover pretty much about half the area of Victoria. So you're probably looking at about roughly half the area of the North Island with wind turbines and solar panels.
Wow, that's huge.
It's just because Carl Sagan said like a back of the envelope calculations are invaluable. They can quickly bust an idea that sounds great. Yeah, and like I'm just a humble journalists that I've run some of them, and it just comes out staggering. Like, to convert the entire world just on current energy consumption to renewables, you would pretty much have to cover the equivalent of India in panels and wind turbines. So, of course, there's the environmental cost of that. And they just make assumptions so heroic they could leap tall buildings in a single bound. Where are you going to get the people to build all this stuff? We already have a skilled worker shortage as is. And you've got to assume that the rest of the world is going to be doing the same thing. So there's going to be a massive shortage of skilled workers. The materials will be in very short supply and they'll just go up in price because, more people want them. Then there's things like, the battery, they like to brag about their big batteries. The one in South Australia, I think, I'm not sure if it still is, it was the biggest in the world. It can only supply a few minutes worth of power. And the other thing that people forget is that household electricity is only a fraction of total energy consumption. There's other things that run on oil and gas and coal, things like transport, industry. So to electrify all of those is just the people just have no real inkling of what sort of tasks they're talking about.
Well, they're kind of like public transport advocates. They think everybody should catch a bus. And my saying about public transport is everyone has these grand ideas about how public transport should operate. But the reality of the situation is that public transport is essentially a non-functioning in the real world environment. Now, in Melbourne, for example, when I lived there, public transport I thought was pretty reasonable, but I came from New Zealand where public transport's rubbish. But the reality is most people like the convenience of their private motor vehicle, and they'll have that prized from their cold, dead hands long before they'll take a tram or a bus or cycle or God forbid, they walk anywhere. And the politicians.
That's why we need our 15-minute cities.
Well, we don't. Do I want to live in a city like that? No, I don't want to do that. But they're for other people to live in. It's the same thing, right? These politicians, and mostly green politicians, but also mostly on the left side of politics, have these grandiose ideas of how we should all live, and then reality smacks them in the face, and they still are pushing that, and eventually they disappear off the political landscape. But their ideas have handcuffed us to a society that is dependent on the state. And that's what those 15-minute cities essentially make people dependent on the state. And that might be the city council or the state government or whatever. But that's what they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, it is easy to make an argument from hypocrisy, but you've got to say, like, if some of these people really seriously believed what they say, they would change their lives dramatically, and they don't practice what they preach. One of the teal independents in Australia, they're called teals because they're blue-green. They're very rich, but they espouse green, politics. In fact, the Greens Party collectively are the richest voting bloc in Australia. If you look at where people vote green and teal, it's all the inner cities of Sydney and Melbourne, some of the most expensive suburbs in Australia. That's where the Greens' power base is. And so one of the teal independents, Monique Ryan, Mongo as I call her, she was recently revealed that she has taken 27 business class flights from Melbourne to Canberra since she was elected.
Shameless,
she's got a bigger carbon footprint than the average African nation.
Well, the thing is these hypocrites, when they're busted for that, they say, "Oh, but I bought carbon credits." So who paid for that? It wasn't you, was it? Oh no, that's right, the government did. So it's just nuts that these hypocrites are foisting these societal changes on us and then womble off into the ether, onto the speaking circuit, flying around, going to Davos and places like that in their jets, while they're all telling us how we should all be impoverished and live in caves and maybe make our own candles, and you don't really need to have power. You can coexist just by walking around barefoot preferably, because it's better for the...
It's astonishing how, I mean, these people aren't stupid, but it's astonishing how ignorant they are about the very things they talk about. I mean, Steve Koonin, who is by no means a denier, he was the science advisor to the Obama administration. Yeah, he's a physicist, so he's a hard numbers guy. And his book, Unsettled, is very good reading because it just shows that the disconnect between what is actually in the science and what is reported and widely believed is just incredibly vast. And it's a game of telephone. You have the scientists doing their work. The IPCC compiles their assessment reports, which are just compilations of scientific papers, blah, blah, blah.
More like necromancy, isn't it, really?
Then those get synthesized into what are called the summary for policymakers. And particularly at that point, that's when you're getting a lot of non-scientists, active, NGOs, that sort of thing, having input. So it's dumbed down and put into the summary, and then the politicians and the media actually only ever read the press releases that accompany the summary for policymakers. And the press releases are another remove from the actual science. So, they're just, you look at the Just Stop Oil protesters, who are almost exclusively very well-off, private school educated people, and they're incredibly ignorant. Like, they say, oh, look at the wildfires in California or Canada, the earth is burning. And it's just not true. NASA themselves say that global wildfire has decreased by 25% in the last decade. So, the world isn't burning, it's burning far less. The world is getting greener, it's not turning into a desert. Again, NASA's own reports say that global forest cover has increased, and which is what you would expect in a slightly more carbon dioxide-rich environment. So essentially, there's no real evidence at all that... The thing is, climate change, it has some downsides, but it also has upsides. For instance, more greenery, more food. So there is a balance, and the best evidence is that there is not going to be a net negative until at least the end of the century. So imagine us saying to people in 1900, well, you can't have motor cars, you can't have coal fires, you can't have electricity, because in 100 years, people who are already going to be immeasurably richer than you, are going to face some consequences. They'd have told you to go to hell.
It's Luddite type behavior, really. But I've been watching a few of the videos that are coming out of Australia with these stop oil people that are sitting blocking the traffic, and then some citizens decide that they're going to sort it out. And there was a good one going around yesterday on Twitter of this woman who'd had enough of being blocked by these people, walked up to another female protester, grabbed her by the hair and just dragged her off the street. The frustration levels are building, and they're lucky they're getting their hair pulled at the moment. It's not going to be too long before some truck driver decides to get out and sort it out with a lump of 4x2.
Yeah, and it's I think it was Brendan O'Neill called it a dictatorship of the prigs, because they're almost always very very well-to-do people. They're the idle rich, basically, and who are sitting around finger-wagging working class people, just who are just trying to get to work or do their job.
Well, I put a lot of these problems that we're facing, and some of the ones that you've addressed today, down to the fact that conservatives don't fight. Conservatives don't say, you know what, that's a stupid idea, shut up.
Yeah.
We just say, oh, that's nice, dear, thank you for your opinion. And then we actually don't see the danger of allowing those people to keep pushing their opinions out there till you get to the ridiculous situation where we have these kids that are stopping vehicles on the road, where you have boys who think they're girls and girls that think they're boys, because nobody's actually said, you know what, no, that's stupid. Go to your room.
Yeah.
Go to your room. You're on timeout until you get a hold of yourself. You know,
and it's kind of the nature of things. I mean, most people aren't that interested in these. They just want to go to work, do their job, go home, hang out with their families. Yeah, they're not interested in being activists or that sort of thing. Unfortunately, they may not be interested in being activists, but activists are very interested in them.
Oh, yes, very, very, especially the useful idiots.
Yeah, and so it eventually does come to it. Once people start seeing it in their daily lives, it comes to a crunch point, and unfortunately, it can get nasty. Which is whereupon the left sort of say, "Oh, look, look what they're doing to us. They're being mean." It's like, well, yeah, they've had enough.
But in New Zealand, net zero has turned out to mean that we stop our oil and gas industry, that we have some of the largest coal reserves in the world, and of particularly good anthracite coals and things like that. We've got some of the best, but we're not digging it up. We're not using it. We're net importers of dirty Indonesian coal.
Yeah.
And Australia is insulated a little bit from that because so far the mining communities and the politicians have realised that Australia's external income that you get from exporting goods like coal, like oil, like gas, those sorts of things. And you mentioned right at the start, you're exporting gas to the Europe because the Ukrainians or the Russian pipeline's been destroyed. These are all things that are helping the Australian economy, and pretty much I think the Australian public gets that, apart from those inner city, young people who've never wanted for anything in their life and have the latest cell phone and all the accoutrements of wealth that go with it and can't afford to sit on the street and annoy people.
Yes, well, you had the very telling incident was before the last election. I can't remember. It was a few years ago. Bob Brown got his caravan of something. It was an anti-coal thing, and it was just basically the usual gaggle of what I call the nosy nanas, the retired leftist boomer ladies and student radicals, and they had a little caravan that trundled up the east coast of Australia. And when they got to Queensland, they didn't know what had hit them. There was entire towns just lining the streets to abuse the shit out of them because, it was their livelihoods on the line. But you mentioned Australia. Australia has vast reserves of coal and gas. Australia also has vast reserves of another potential energy source, which you did mention briefly before, and that's nuclear. Yes. Australia also has some of the world's largest known reserves of thorium, which is a budding nuclear technology and a very promising one at that.
Yeah, thorium reactors are real interesting. It's a whole nother discussion.
So, and that's where, becoming opposition leader after a loss is always a poison chalice. So it's, Peter Dutton is unsurprisingly struggling in the polls. But he's not the most telegenic chap. It must be admitted. He's an ex-Queensland copper, and he looks it.
Yeah.
But he's finding some. I think he's finding some points of difference, because the problem, of course, is that, like National and ACT in New Zealand, the Liberals, particularly in Australia, are just hopeless. They think that the only way to get elected is to basically be like the Greens, but just wear a better suit. So you've got.
I'm not sure that's I'm not sure that's a winning proposition, but I guess they're going to find that out. Fairly sure, and certainly the National Party is going to find out that being just like Labor but a little bit less rubbish is not a compelling reason for people to change their vote.
No, and they only have to look at Tony Abbott. I mean, again, Tony Abbott was absolutely hated by the media. And look, back in the day when I was still a Labor voter, I detested him as well. But then one day, I just, out of curiosity, I picked up his little manifesto, battle lines, and read them. But this is actually a pretty smart guy, and a lot of what he's saying is not at all unreasonable. And what Abbott did was when John Howard lost government, it was a landslide for Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd had the sort of popularity that Jacinda Ardern could have only dreamed of. He was running like 70% approval in the opinion polls. And of course, we all know what happened after that. But to his credit, Tony Abbott turned that around in just one term to going from a landslide loss to coming within a bee's dick of getting government back. If it wasn't for the two so-called conservatives in New England, Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor, they would have had government.
Yeah.
So, and then it was another term after that, and they won. And Abbott did that by not being woke, not being weak and wet. He took the fight to them, and he absolutely hammered Julia Gillard over the carbon tax thing. He used a lot of three-word slogans and that, but he did so with devastating effectiveness. Like great big new tax that just hit the government so hard. And then he won government, and unfortunately, once he was in government, he kind of lost his mojo. Like they tried to do the classic thing of put all the bad stuff in your first budget, and of course, it generated a massive backlash, and they got spooked, and the party dumped him and put in Malcolm Turnbull instead, and then we ended up with Scott Morrison. Of course, Abbott also made a massive mistake of thinking that he could get away with breaking an election promise in his first term, nobody cared. And the thing is, Australians had had enough of that with Julia Gillard. Like the day before the election, says very clearly there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead. Makes a deal with the Greens and brings in a carbon tax. So Australians were really jack of being taken for mugs like that. So when Abbott said, I think it was they won't be changing pensions. First budget, they changed pensions. That was a pretty fatal mistake.
Yeah.
But, he just showed that, a politician with a bit of mongrel, like a conservative politician who's just got a bit of mongrel, who ignores the media, because, they seem to think that they can get the media on side. That's never going to happen.
No.
I mean, Malcolm Turnbull was beloved by the media until he became a Conservative Prime Minister, and then they turned on him.
Well, so, the problem with Malcolm Turnbull was that he was just a rich kid blowhard who liked to talk himself down as being the everyday bloke of Australia, and he just so wasn't,
Yeah, well, I mean, he didn't grow up in a commission house with a single mother like Albanese, as he'll tell anybody who doesn't want to know. But so Dutton needs, so like to look, you look in, say, Victoria, the Liberal leader there, John Pesutto, he's just pathetic. He's being sued by his own for defamation by his own ex-MP, because he basically called her a Nazi.
Yeah.
Because she stood up at a women's rights rally that was very suspiciously gate crashed by a gaggle of edgelords doing Hitler salutes.
Yeah.
So Dutton seems to be finding a few points of difference, and if he can pull the party into line behind him, for instance.
Well, Dutton's got the same problem that Christopher Luxon has. He's bald.
Yeah.
Right. And like people criticize me for saying that, but the facts show that bald people generally don't get elected to leadership positions. They don't win elections. They have to do something spectacular to get elected, or to jimmy the system, like Benito Mussolini, for example. But the only politician you could say who is genuinely bald and got elected off his own merits was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Dutton, you just look at him and you think, oh, if he's wearing a Queensland hat, everyone's still looking at him going, yeah, but you're just a bald guy with a hat on now. And it sounds facetious and it sounds superficial, but that's how the majority of people look at politicians. They look at them and go, oh,
Peter Gutman pulled it off in Tassie.
Yeah.
Although I think he had the first wave of COVID factor. I mean, for the first round of elections after COVID, it was a bonus because people were still buying into the fear mongering. So, but Peter Gutman, managed to hold on to government in Tasmania. It's very difficult. Tasmania's electoral system is even more convoluted than MMP.
Oh, it's a polling system in some of the states.
But as I say, Dutton is doing no referendum, and like only 8 out of 44 referendums, going back to that, in Australia have ever passed. Yeah. None have ever passed without bipartisan support.
Yeah.
Even those that have had bipartisan support often don't, like the Republic referendum. But basically, once Dutton said, "Okay, no, we're adopting a no stance," that was probably a killer blow. But he's found on that one. He's found some mojo. Like, if the referendum goes down, basically he's sided with the Australian people against the elite that Anthony Albanese was pushing. And he's openly canvassing now nuclear, which has been a forbidden topic in Australian politics for decades, but more and more people in the street. And you'd be saying, well, maybe we do need to think about it.
Yeah. Just finally, to round out, listeners in New Zealand have been watching what's going on in Victoria, and we saw Dictator Dan just show absolute excesses of totalitarianism during the COVID lockdown. But strangely, he managed to win the last election. But what are his prospects now? He's got that election under his belt now, but how's he faring? Are people tiring of Dictator Dan now?
I think so. I mean, Victorians are weird, and I say that as someone who was born and raised in Victoria.
You live in Tasmania and you're calling Victorians weird?
Yes. Yeah. Well, during my own family, during the whole COVID thing, they were just it was quite the Stockholm syndrome. Like, I'd be on the phone to my mum and she'd be like, "Oh no, I've got to go. Dan's coming on the telly." And
what?
Yeah, they were glued to it. I mean, and they are utterly convinced of things that are just not true. Like this, they're like, "Oh, Dan saved Victoria from COVID." It's like, no, he didn't. Victoria had the worst COVID outcome of any state in Australia, and that was once it all happened after he put in lockdowns. Lockdowns didn't stop it; they made it worse. But it all came from New South Wales. Like, no, they genomically traced the COVID outbreaks in Melbourne, and nearly all of them came from the hotel quarantine scheme. But Victorians, you just cannot convince them otherwise.
It's like New Zealand people are still convinced that Jacinda Ardern saved us. We're our country is, groaning under a mountain of debt as a result of the borrowing that happened. She swanned off to various different cushy jobs and left us all to it. But there's still people out there who think that, Jacinda Ardern saved us by locking us all up in our houses.
Yeah, although I think the last Victorian election wasn't as clear-cut as people tend to think it was. Because the problem and this is what also happened with the federal election. If you look at the federal election, Albanese got the lowest vote for the Labor Party in a century and the second lowest in history, in Australia's history. He got a vote, 32% primary vote. Now, in the 90s, when John Howard was Prime Minister, Labor had landslide losses with 40% of the primary vote.
Right.
But the problem that's happened is that conservative voters are so disgusted with the so-called conservative parties that they're deserting them. And so you're seeing a lot of votes getting pretty much siphoned off into minor parties. So, I don't think the Victorian election was quite as resounding victory for Andrews as it looked, because he may have won a lot of seats, but he didn't win as many votes as you might have expected.
Yeah, and that's the vagaries of that Australian voting system, isn't it? With preferential votes, and you've got to have a down ticket in supporting parties so that your preferences can pick that. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
So Labor has the Greens as that helps them. With
and I would point to Jeff Kennett as well. Like we had, we had another Labor government that almost bankrupted the state. Kennett came in with a thumping majority, and he basically repaired the state's finances. The next election, he seemed to win pretty convincingly again, but you could tell that there was an undercurrent. And then the election after that, basically hubris got to him. The election after that he was tossed out. And it was definitely hubris comes before a fall. One thing I particularly, because I still lived in Victoria at that time, I particularly remember, like, their election campaign was Jeff Rules. They thought they were being really cute and going for the young vote and that sort of thing. But I think that got on the nose with a lot of people. Like, he's supposed to govern, not rule. And there was a very, very famous interview he did with John Fain, who was like, the king of talk radio in Melbourne. And basically Jeff Kennett just refused. He just stopped talking to him. Like, he was asking him a few hard questions, and Jeff Kennett literally said, well, I'm not going to add to that. I'm just going to sit here and drink my tea. And then there was just awkward silence, and it did not play well for him.
And of course, Labor put up a much younger Steve Bracks back then, didn't he? Because I was living in Melbourne at the time when that election happened. And, Steve Bracks came through, had a promising good start to his government, but in reality ended up essentially being labelled as corrupt.
Yes.
And that was the end of him. But it's been Labor governments ever since. There hasn't been.
Yeah, I think all but 4 of the last 25 years have been Labor governments.
Mm.
I have a feeling that old dictator Dan will bow out. He's got his statue on Treasury Place, again, thanks to rule that Jeff Kennett brought in. So, which I imagine will be a fodden target for vandals for many years to come. But, I think he'll be out while the getting's good, and his successor will be left to carry the can, much again as John Cain did. He quit and dumped it all in Joan Kerner's lap. So, and she never had a hope. And look, Kerner, she was a leftist. She was from the socialist left of the party, but I don't think she was an entirely bad politician. But she never had a chance. So,
no.
And that whole thing of just dropping the ball, I wouldn't put money on it, but I would not be surprised to see the voice referendum called off. It's not locked in yet. Basically, once they announce a referendum date, then by law they have to hold it, and they haven't yet. And now they thought he would probably announce the referendum date at the Garma Festival, which is an Aboriginal cultural festival next month.
Yeah.
And he said, no, they won't be announcing it till September at least.
Well, he's running out of time to get it done, and he's already been in power a year. If he leaves it much longer, it's going to run into the second half of his term, in which case it could negatively affect him. But
yeah, so I've got a feeling, I've just got a little niggle that it might
I'll
actually
just make
be...
a note of this prediction, Lushington, and we'll see. We'll see if it comes true in another episode.
But we know what's going to happen if it's either dumped or if it loses. They will just, we'll just be screamed at as the world's as racists, or calling and insulting voters, as Hillary Clinton knows, works really well.
Yeah, it generally doesn't work as well as the politician who issued the insults think it was going to work out for it.
But it's been, even the very fact of calling the referendum has by nature been divisive. And if you look at, say, American politics, Obama, I think, is responsible for a lot of the problems, cultural problems that grip America now. He reignited race in America in a way that no politician had done for decades. Even during the primaries he played the race card against Hillary Clinton, because, as people conveniently forget, it was the Clinton campaign who started the whole birther argument.
Yeah.
And
of course, the Clinton campaign are the most dirty and despicable you can imagine. You look at the birther campaign they mounted against Obama, and then later they mounted a similar one against Trump. That it was the Hillary Clinton campaign that hired, a Steele to create this dossier, which had all sorts of juicy details in it, which were completely made up and actually a fantasy and imagination of Steele. But the media just ran with it all like it was verbatim, and it's all been proven now that.
So I think
rubbish.
There's not going. So I think just the very fact of having this referendum on a racial issue has been incredibly divisive just by its nature. So I don't think as it looks, we will probably dodge a bullet and vote the referendum down. But there's not going to be a lot of real winners from it, because it's set up some really divisive, nasty politics. And it's unfortunate, but
that's where it's going to go. Well, on that note, I think we will wrap up this segment of the political tragics from the Australian point of view, from Lushington v. Brady. Perhaps you might like to tell readers or listeners where they can get their book from.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, a great read. It's available from Amazon on Kindle ebook and in paperback for print on demand. And it's what I call a good toilet read. It's lots of short articles. You can read one or two while you're contemplating the world.
Shouting Across the Ditch, the collected Lushington Brady Volume 1, Trans-Tasman Politics, Culture, and Everything in Between. You can find that on Amazon. I found that discussion about the voice referendum fascinating. Lushington believes it's likely to fail or get pulled to save Albo the embarrassment of a loss. Net zero appears to have a multi-trillion-dollar price tag. Yeah, that's right. It's with a T. And that's giving the politicians kittens as they try and justify impoverishing their nation for a fanciful idea such as net zero. And the cost of living in Australia is as bad as it is in New Zealand. And they've got the same problem that we have here, politicians that refuse to acknowledge that they're part of the problem, not part of the solution.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.